Hello everyone, welcome to UGC 112, World Civilizations 2. This is Lecture 13, Russia. The history of Russia begins with the migration of peoples in the 5th to 6th century CE. These were Indo-European speakers moving into Eastern Europe as Germanic tribes moved further and further west into the Roman Empire, and then, the remnants of what was the Western Roman Empire. And these Indo-European speakers were Slavs. So their branch of the Indo-European language was the Slavic branch. And over time, the different tribes that there were kind of coalesced into 3 different branches of Slavic. We have the Western Slavs there, people like the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Poles. Then you also had the Southern Slavic, the Croats, the Serbs. And then you also had the Eastern Slavic speakers. These people are from like the Ukraine, and Russia will be in this one. And of course, as Russia expanded and other peoples would migrate, there were different ethnicities that entered into the Russian state as well, but as a strong basis in Slavic. In the 9th century, the first Eastern Slavic state formed around the city of Kiev, which is in modern-day Ukraine. And here you can see Kiev right there on the Dnieper River. The earliest chronicles say that Vikings were the ones who moved in and united the Slavs into this state. So there was this kind of a small ruling class who were Viking in origin, and had united the Slavs in the area into this Kievan Russian state. And they were the ones who controlled the trade between the Byzantine Empire and Scandinavia up there. The interactions that they had with the Byzantine Empire led them to the adoption of Christianity in 988. Here we can see Vladimir the Great, who was the Prince of Kiev when Christianity was adopted. And the Christianity that they chose, since it was coming from the Byzantine Empire, was the Eastern variety. So after 1054, when the church splits between the West, who become Catholic, and the East, who become Orthodox, it's not a surprise then that Russia would be an Orthodox type of Christianity. So they have their own Eastern-style Christianity, which is Russian Orthodoxy. These people in the East, obviously, after 1054, didn't recognize the superiority of the Pope. Instead, each of the different Orthodox churches had these head bishops. For example, Russia had its own patriarch, sometimes called a metropolitan. Constantinople had a patriarch, also called a metropolitan. The island of Cyprus had a patriarch. And these heads of the different churches were all considered equals. And that was one of the big points between the why Orthodoxy split from Catholicism. Well, they kind of split away from each other. The Pope in Rome wanted to be, the head of the church, thought that he should since he was in Rome. The bishops in the East, especially the Patriarch of Constantinople, never really agreed with that idea. They all felt that they were equals to the Pope in Rome. So that's why they split, and Russia is going to be on the Orthodox side. The Patriarch of Constantinople was always closely tied to the Byzantine Emperor, and likewise in Russia, the Metropolitan/Patriarch of Russia will often be closely tied to the Russian state and the ruler of the Russian state. The son of Vladimir the Great was called Yaroslav the Wise, and he was the one who gave Russia its first set of laws, its first law code, in the early 10th century. And here we could see a facial reconstruction of Yaroslav the Wise based on his skull, and this is done by the same man who did that reconstruction that we saw of Timur. Kievan Rus began to decline due to the fighting of many of the royal families. There's always fighting for succession, just like we saw in many of the different groups of people that we've seen already. People in the royal family wanted to become the prince who was ruling everything, and then that leads to decline. And even Yaroslav himself, kind of considered the zenith of Kievan Russia in terms of culture and influence. He had to fight for the throne himself. But eventually, this kind of fighting leads to a decline, and eventually these pressures would just mount up until they were actually conquered due to a people that we are well aware of from the last few lectures. The Mongols. So remember how we saw them sweep into Persia, right down here earlier, and then we saw them sweep into China as well. Well, remember how that we also mentioned that they came into Europe and attacked the peoples there, and one of those peoples was the Kievan Russians, and they brought down the Kievan Russia. It broke off into many different smaller little states with different Russian princes. And these princes had to pay tribute to the Mongols. This is all stuff that we've seen so far. But if they paid the tribute to the Mongols, they were also allowed a great deal of freedom to rule how they wished. And some were even able to act as deputies of the Khans. So they actually have this kind of title as deputy of the Khans. Also not surprising, the Muslim Khans, the Muslim Mongols, allowed Russia to remain Orthodox Christian. And because of the freedom that these princes had, and because they were able to keep their Orthodox Christianity, the princes of Russia during this time actually preferred the Muslim Khans to the Catholic Crusaders, who could, theoretically come and help them fight off these Mongols. And that's because they saw the Crusaders as trying to steal their land and convert them to Catholicism. The Crusades had not been very helpful to Constantinople in the past. They kind of had they felt safer with the Mongols, and they felt more in control than they did with the Catholic Crusaders. And there were, of course, some positive impacts from Mongol rule as well. That includes military tactics that they learned from the Mongols, as well as military organization. And the Mongols also helped them create a series of roads that were used in their postal service. So this postal service was founded, and along with these roads. So some positive impacts from the Mongol rule of Russia, or Mongol influence. If we're not really calling it a rule, if the princes are still there, but they're just little vassal states to the Mongol Khanate. It was also during the Mongol period that the city of Moscow grew in importance. At the very beginning, Moscow started as a subordinate to the city called Vladimir, the city-state called Vladimir. So Moscow was really small, just a subordinate to that city-state even. But the princes of Moscow, over time, decided that they would cooperate with the Mongols and Eventually, the ruler of Moscow was given the title of Grand Prince of Moscow, and the city itself was assigned the task of collecting the tribute that would go to the Mongols. So they'd go around to the different Russian cities, collect the tribute that was going to the Mongols, and they were the ones who handed it over. So working closely with the Mongols gave Moscow this title and this influence throughout other parts of Russia. In 1299, the head of the Russian Church, the Metropolitan of Kiev, right? That makes sense because since the former state was based in Kiev, the head of the Russian Church would live in Kiev. Well, the Metropolitan of Kiev moved to Vladimir in 1299. And then in 1325, he settled down permanently in Moscow. So, with the head of the Russian Church now in Moscow, that obviously adds to the importance of Moscow as well. As this city grew more and more powerful, they became more and more confident in themselves as well. And over time, the Grand Princes of Moscow even began to oppose the Mongols, who had helped them rise in power. So they didn't want to pay tribute anymore. They wanted to be more free. And one of the most influential Grand Princes of Moscow was this man here, Ivan III, who would gain the name Ivan the Great due to his accomplishments. Through conquest, purchase, marriage alliances, he was able to gain quite a bit of land that had been under the control of other Russian states. So here you can see in the dark blue what Ivan inherited, the land around Moscow, and then the light blue you can see is what he would gain through, like I said, conquest, outright buying, and marriage alliances. And this included Novgorod, right here, which was one of the really, really big, important Russian cities. That was actually where the Viking nobility came from and had moved down to Kiev from there. So that's a big gain for Ivan III. The territory that they gained became provinces of Moscow, and the land owned by the princes of this area became the property of the Grand Prince of Moscow, obviously Ivan III. And it wasn't just these princes who, had sold their land or who had been conquered, but it was also true of the land owned by Ivan's own brothers and his other kin as well in Moscow. So basically, if you were a prince in rank, no matter where you were in the part that Moscow now owned, that your land then became the land of Ivan. The princes were also stripped of their titles, and instead of being, Prince of Novgorod, he would then enter the nobility of Moscow. So these princes not only lost all their land, they were stripped of any title for ruling and instead joined the nobility of Moscow, who had some help, who helped a little bit Ivan when he was ruling. So, it's a great loss of power, but at the same time, at least they're still kind of being worked into a system. Like I said, you can see the dark blue of what Ivan inherited compared to the light blue that he gained. This is almost tripling the size of Moscow's territory. Not only did he opposed the Mongols, but Ivan actually was the Grand Prince of Moscow who ended their dominance over the city and their growing state. And even for a time during his reign, the Kazan Khanate was forced to become a vassal state to Moscow. Eventually they broke free again, But for at least a brief time during his reign, not only did he oppose the Mongols, but he actually had forced them to recognize his rule and pay tribute to him, at least the Kazan Khanate. And here we see a 19th century painting, this idealized portrayal of Ivan opposing the Mongol envoys. He's ripped the letter that they sent to him. There's half of it in his hand. There's the other half there. And, telling them that he will not be paying them tribute anymore. When Ivan's first wife died, the Pope in Italy actually suggested that he marry the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. You'll remember Constantine the 11th died while trying to fight off the Ottomans. And so the Pope had his niece. She had fled to the west. Her name was Zoe at the time, but when she moved to the west, she changed it to Sophia. So Sophia was offered by the Pope to Ivan, and it was hoped that she would help convert Ivan to Catholicism, just like she had been converted to Catholicism after she ran away. But it didn't quite work out as the Pope expected. She did marry Ivan, but as soon as she got to Russia, she reverted back to Orthodoxy instead. So she chose the faith of her ancestors, Orthodoxy, instead of converting Ivan to Catholicism. Around the same time of Sophia's arrival, we see an introduction of Byzantine-inspired ceremonies to the Russian court. So you get this greater sense of Byzantine influence among the ruling party of Russia. And this went as far as what Ivan began to call himself. So whenever he was in the court or actually corresponding with other foreign powers, he began to call himself the Tsar and Autocrat of Moscow. And here you can see the two different spellings of Tsar. Tsar was just the Russian form of Caesar, which was, of course, an allusion to the title of Roman emperors. So now we kind of see, by taking on this title, or at least calling himself this title, Ivan is really beginning to equate himself with the Byzantines and the Romans who came before those Byzantines. And this didn't just go with the title, and like I said, the ceremonies, and now marrying this Byzantine princess. Ivan and his successors really began to push this idea of Moscow being the third Rome. What does this mean? Well, they were a political and religious center, right? Rome had its last emperor fall in 476 CE. Constantinople obviously fell in 1453, so those two different Romes had fallen, and had, at least according to the Russians now, were no longer political and religious centers. That was now being passed on to Russia. Russia was going to fill the void. They were going to be the heir apparent to the Byzantine Empire, which was the heir apparent to the Roman Empire. And of course, here we see this is the Russian, what would become the Russian coat of arms with the double-headed eagle. The double-headed eagle was originally used by the Byzantine Empire as their symbols. So Ivan III begins to use that on his own rings. This is actually from Ivan IV, this depiction here. But yeah, so we see Moscow now trying to claim that it is, this new political and Christian center of the world. But now, since Moscow is going to try to claim that it is great as Rome and Constantinople, Ivan had to, start an impressive building program so that it could at least try to look somewhat equal to these two great cities that the world, two of the greatest cities that the world had ever seen. So he starts this building program, to try and raise them onto the same level. To do so, he imported Italian artists who helped him design, among other structures. We see the Palace of the Facets right here, this square building here. This would be the main banquet hall of the Moscow Tsars. There was also the Ivan the Great Bell Tower. It began in 1505 by Ivan, and it was finished by his son, Vasily. And the height of the tower, this is the tower here. The height of it was actually increased in 1600, but it was begun under Ivan to try to make the city look more grand. Unfortunately, he would die before it was finished. But a building that was finished while he was alive is the Dormition Cathedral. This was designed and built by Rodolfo Fioravanti, and this man had worked actually for Cosimo de' Medici. So this is right, during the time of the Renaissance in the West, and some of the same artists who worked for that urban nobility that we saw in Florence and other parts of Italy were working for the Russian Tsar. This was the church that housed the head of the Russian church during Ivan's reign. This is the first real grand church of Moscow as the Third Rome, and because of that, it would house the Metropolitan of Moscow. So after Ivan III dies, his son Vasily continued many of his same policies and tried to consolidate what his father had gained. And then when Vasily died, the throne passed on to his eldest son, who was Ivan IV. And Ivan IV would gain the name the Terrible. But terrible has a different meaning now than it did when the English language started to call him the Terrible. A better translation now is probably like the Formidable, the awe-inspiring. It's not terrible as in like evil. It's more of like terrible as in someone who would inspire fear, which I guess still sounds kind of evil, but it's like I said, it's more about being formidable, being a great opponent or something like that. And Ivan IV was a very, very complex man who's been described as both intelligent and devout, while also being prone to episodes of rage and mental instability. And here we could see a reconstruction of Ivan IV. Again, this is from his skull. This is by the same man who did the one of Yaroslav and the one of Timur. He became Grand Prince of Moscow at the age of 3, and his mother served as regent until she died when he was 8, with the possibility that she was poisoned. And from being 8 to about 16, different members of different leading noble families tried to act as regent for Ivan, which would have some effect on him. At age 16, he was finally crowned in the Dormition Cathedral as Tsar of all the Russias, which is a new title, right? Ivan III had been calling himself Tsar of Moscow. At age 16, Ivan IV decided that he was going to be Tsar of all the Russias, not just Moscow, but any people who considered themselves Russians he was claiming to rule over them. And as Tsar, he basically ruled as an absolute monarch. The decisions really came down to him. This is the first big step towards the Tsar being an absolute monarch, and it's just going to grow during over time. So besides his mother possibly being poisoned and these leading noble families, trying to act as regents over him, his first wife also may have been poisoned, and one of his key advisors, who was a noble, defected over to an enemy called the Lithuanians. And all of these events kind of came together and led to a great distrust that he had in the nobles. Right? His mother, his wife may have been poisoned. Nobles tried to, act as regents for him, and then the ones that he did trust abandoned him. So really, he had this great distrust of nobles, and during his reign, he had many of them executed or exiled, or even forced them to become monks. And this went as far as the head of the Russian church, the Metropolitan Philip II, was one of the people that he had murdered because he distrusted them. So a little bit of paranoia in Ivan IV. Remember, I again said that he wasn't, he was known as this very intelligent man, but at the same time prone to mental instability, and paranoia was definitely one of those. Besides executing a bunch of nobles, Ivan also did some good for Russia. He brought a lot of different reforms to the Russian state. One was that he introduced a parliamentary body to Russia, which was broken up into 3 groups. They were the nobles, the church, and the merchants and the town people. And these were kind of like 3 estates that made up Russia, all had a voice in this parliamentary body. And when we look at France in the next lecture, there's going to be something very similar to that, and it's been suggested that this parliamentary body was kind of based upon the different estates that France had, in fact. He also created the Chosen Council, which was made up of nobles who acted as advisors. So even though he distrusts a great many of them, obviously there are people that he's going to trust, and those would be members of this Chosen Council. Calling upon this new parliamentary body, he was able then to revise the law code. Like I said, he's an absolute monarch, but maybe not as strong as some of the other absolute monarchs we've seen. And he worked with this body that he created. Obviously, it would be filled with people who supported him, but through this, he was able to revise the law code, and a lot of these laws gave more power on the local level. And so here we can see a little copy of the law code. He also created different units they acted as guards mainly, but they were always around. They were standing units, and these were called the streltsy, or shooters, and that's because they used gunpowder. Here we could see some streltsy there. There's one of their firearms right there, also carrying some badass axes and swords. Wow. But yeah, so the streltsy were this kind of elite guard group. There were ones who guarded Moscow, and specifically the Kremlin, which was kind of like the political center of Moscow. But there were also streltsy located in the municipal areas, and they acted as border guards. And the local officials who were gaining more power through the law code relied on these streltsy to help force force their actions upon the people. They really gave the local officials support when they needed it. Ivan IV also worked to unify the different religious rituals and ecclesiastical regulations that were all across Russia, tried to unify them into one basic practice, one type of certain set of rituals, one body of regulations that would apply to all of Russia. Aided by the Streltsy, Ivan IV greatly expanded Russia's territory, especially to the east and south. Doing so, he defeated the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates, and then even went further and pushed off into conquering bits of Siberia. By doing this, and here we could see in the light green the areas that he took, the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of the Astrakhan, and then here further into Siberia, all during the time of Ivan the Terrible. But in taking these lands from these Mongols, it made Russia a multi-ethnic and more diverse empire, right? I mean, there's not just Slavs living in this area now. Especially the areas that they had taken over. As a reaction to the fall of the Khanates, the Crimea and Ottoman forces, so here's the Khanate of the Crimea, the Ottoman Empire is down here, they joined forces. In fact, the Khanate of the current Crimea was a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, but they joined forces and actually tried to invade Moscow. And they were so thoroughly defeated that the Ottomans and the Crimea gave up their plans to expand north altogether after they were so defeated by the Russians and the Streltsy, who especially held them off. So Ivan was very successful against the Mongols. He was successful in defending off the Ottomans, but he was not quite successful when he tried to invade Poland over here. Failed there, but he did establish trading ties with the West. So didn't conquer it. You can see Kiev here, still part of Poland at this time. Couldn't take that back, but did create better trading ties with Western Europe. Ivan was a poet. He wrote different liturgies for churches and different poems. So it's not surprising then that he was also a supporter of the arts. He actually ordered the founding of Russia's first printing press, the Moscow Printing Yard, and here it is. Still survives today. At least the building does. This is the Moscow Printing Yard, the very first printing press in Russia. In order to commemorate his victory over the Kazans and the Astrakhanate, he built St. Basil's Cathedral right in the heart of Moscow. St. Basil's is actually named after a saint who's buried there. And funny enough, this man Basil stood up against Ivan when he was around. They actually lived during the same period. He stood up against Ivan and said that he wasn't being respectful enough of the Orthodox religion, which was a pretty bold move. I mean, remember, at one point, the head of the Russian church was actually executed under the orders of Ivan. But in this case, Ivan IV really respected him for it. And when Basil died, he acted as a pallbearer for at the funeral of Basil. And obviously this man Basil would become a saint in the Russian church, most likely with the help of the Tsar of all the Russias, right? I mean, he kind of puts, if he says that this guy is a saint, people are going to listen. The building itself is just an amazing piece of architecture, combined elements of both Italian and Russian styles together. It's kind of like, in its own way, a Renaissance piece, right? Where, remember how in the Renaissance we saw the modern Italian mixing with the classical world? Well, here we see the modern and classical Italian world mixing with the Russian world to form something entirely new. You can see the massive central tower there, surrounded by smaller towers in the cardinal directions, like this one here. And then there were even smaller towers on the diagonals between the cardinal directions. And we can see this in the overhead schematic here. There's the large tower. These four would be the next largest in the cardinal directions, and then smaller towers in the diagonals between them. It's just a really amazing church, I think. And much like the Hagia Sophia, this is on my wish list to see. I really want to see this building in person. After Ivan IV, Russia faced a series of problems. The wars that Ivan had fought pushed Russia into greater and greater debt. They were already in debt when he gained the throne, and then fighting off the Ottomans, gaining the area of the Kazans and the Astrakhan, all just added more and more to this debt. And to help pay for that, he had instituted a series of high taxes on people. Obviously people don't like paying high taxes, so there are these high taxes and this debt at the same time that are creating instability in the state. And then there was also a problem with Ivan's successor, Fyodor. Fyodor here, there he is, there's a picture of Fyodor with his lovely curled mustache. He had never really been raised to rule. He was not the heir apparent. He'd just been this middle child. But that all changed when Ivan IV killed his other son in a rage in 1581. So just 3 years before Ivan IV died, he actually killed his eldest son over an argument that they had, and then he was left with Fyodor. And then here's just this amazing painting by Ilya Ripin, that he painted in 1885, so much later. But I don't know, I just think this painting does an amazing job of kind of showing the frantic nature of Ivan IV. You could see he struck his son in the head, and now his son is dying, and then you could see the wild, frenzied eyes of Ivan IV, full of regret at what his rage just did. But as a result of not being raised as the heir, Fyodor really wasn't interested in ruling much at all. He's kind of like Selim the Drunkard, if you'll remember, who came right after Suleiman the Magnificent. So his brother-in-law pretty much did all the ruling for him, and Fyodor had no children when he died, so he was actually the last of the line of Rurik kings, dating theoretically all the way back to those early Viking leaders of Novgorod and Kiev. They had spread out to all the different cities of Russia, but this is the last of the Rurik dynasty. Russia then fell into what is called the Time of Troubles. There were many different people trying to become Tsar, and during that time, from 1601 to 1603, there were a lot of great famines in Russia as well, and nearly 1/3 of Russia's population died from these famines, which was roughly 2 million people. So people fighting over the throne, there's massive famines, people just dying, and for a while Russia even was taken over by Poland and the Lithuanians. They even lost control of their country. But over time, things began to settle with the emergence of a new dynasty, the Romanovs. And the Romanovs, gained control of all Russia again, from the Poles and Lithuanians were forced out. The Romanovs become Tsar, and over time they brought stability back to Russia, and they even began to extend the borders out as far as the Pacific Ocean in the 17th century. Again, even during the Romanov time, there was still contention about who should be Tsar, but eventually it fell upon this man here. This is Peter the Great. He's a part of the Romanov dynasty. He had to fight with his brother, with his half-brother and his sister to gain full control, but once he was able to gain full control of the state, he began immediately to modernize Russia. During his life, he had traveled across much of Western Europe, and he tried to bring back what he learned there to Russia. He reorganized the army using Western European methods and tactics, and he also saw the opportunity that could arise from Russia being a maritime power. He had learned how to build ships in the Netherlands. He had worked as a shipbuilder there. And so he really wanted to make Russia's navy stronger, grow it in size, and have better ports. In terms of society, Peter introduced French clothing styles to his court, and he forced the nobles to wear these modern clothes and to shave their traditional beards by imposing taxes on them. If you wanted to have a long beard, if you wanted to wear the old traditional Russian robes, you were going to be taxed for them. Instead, what many of these people did, instead of spending that money, was they would adopt, clothes like we see Peter wearing here, and shave those beards. He also brought changes to the way that Russians viewed time. He changed the date of the new year from September 1st to January 1st, and he brought in that BC AD system, the one that we now use in this class, right, where we say BCE and CE. It's the same system. He's the one who brought that to Russia. So, thus, the year 72007, so 7207, in the Russian calendar became the year 1700 under Peter the Great. And this was all included in the Julian calendar as well. So lots of changes in the way that the Russians were seeing time. To help him rule, he replaced the old bureaucratic system with a new one that was based on Western ideas, one that was divided into different ministries, different colleges. And as part of this new bureaucracy, he allowed foreigners to take part in it, to be within it. So basically the positions in the government, the military, and the court were from now on determined by merit and service to the Tsar instead of just by birth. So we see a diminishing in the power of the nobility, right? With this new bureaucracy, with the court around him, the people who advanced were those who proved it by, doing great things and by serving the Tsar. along the same lines of changing up the bureaucracy, Peter also abolished the old Council of Nobles, and instead replaced it with a 10-person Senate that these 10 people were appointed by Peter. So, the old nobles once had this body that they would discuss things with the Tsar. Now they are replaced by 10 people who are chosen by Peter. So we really see a centralization of power along Peter the Great. And this is another step in the direction of a more absolute ruler. The children of nobles, as well as the people in the bureaucracy, they were forced to receive an education under Peter the Great, and especially in sciences. So, not only is there this new bureaucracy that, is replacing the old nobles, but now the people who are in it, their children have to be educated, and obviously this is going to be more along Western lines. Peter also tried to make the church a subordinate to him, and he did this by replacing the head of the church, the patriarch, the metropolitan, with, instead of just a single man, he replaced them with a council led by government officials. And the people who are on there obviously would be loyal to Peter, was the idea, right? They owed their status on this Holy Synod, which is what it was called, this council, because of Peter, right? He chose them. He was the one who could remove them as well. It's kind of like what we saw with Henry VIII in England, where he was the de facto head of the Church of England because he was the one who chose the Archbishop of Canterbury, right? Here we see Peter being able to choose who headed up the board, this council of the church. So, obviously, Peter is kind of in charge of the Russian church now. And, this growing empire of Russia still had the old system of the way it was divided up, along the old princely states. So what Peter did was he began to reorganize the country by creating new provinces and new districts. And this was in hopes to make it easier to rule over, right? The divisions made more sense. They were all set for the idea of helping Peter rule. During the reign of Peter, Russia didn't really gain as much territory as it did during some of the other czars. You can see here, so he's the dark orange. This was all gained during the time of the Romanovs, right here. So more of Siberia. Remember how I said that they pushed on to the Pacific Ocean? The dark orange, like along here, is what Peter the Great gained, here and here. And like I said, Far East Asia, here, there were some gains in Central Asia as well. But some of the important things that he gained the especially important ones were things like here, in this area, where he regained Kiev, right, the old center of the old Russian state, as well as right up here along the coast of the Baltic Sea. And this coastal land was going to be especially important because that is where he chose to build his new capital, which was St. Petersburg. So, St. Petersburg was named after St. Peter, obviously, who also happened to share the name of Peter the Great, right? And there had been some settlements in the area before, but basically what Peter does is he creates an entirely new city, one that is planned from the beginning with the help of foreigners. And here you can see a very grid-like system that exists in St. Petersburg. Many serfs were forced to build this, and many died doing so. It was a great effort to build the city. As the city grew, Peter made it the capital of the Russian state, which he began to call the Russian Empire, instead of just, the Tsardom of Russia. It became the Russian Empire. And he wanted the new city to be, very beautiful and of great renown. And since it was a capital, it would need a palace, right? So here is the Summer Palace. Rather modest for the time, considering some of the other palaces that were being built across Europe. Peter is a contemporary of Louis the 14th, and yeah, so you can imagine. Remember, Louis the 14th is the one who built Versailles. This is nothing like Versailles, but it's still, a capital city needs a palace, so here it is. There was a cathedral built there. This is the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, which actually features the world's tallest Orthodox bell tower. You can see just how tall it is. This is the tallest bell tower in the world in terms of Orthodox churches. And this was actually the first real landmark of the city. He had built a fort around to protect it, and as that fort was being built, this cathedral was being built as well. So this is the first real big landmark of the city, the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul. It was not just, St. Petersburg was not just a political and religious center, but it was also meant to be a cultural and learning center as well. And because of that, there were things like the university, an Academy of the Sciences were founded there, as well as a Museum of the of Sciences. And here we see the Museum of the Sciences right there. And many of these buildings were designed by Italian architects and French architects that created their own style that became known as Petrine Baroque, named after Peter the Great, right? So Petrine Baroque became this whole style based on the buildings that were going up in St. Petersburg. Now, basically the legacy of Peter the Great can be summed up in one word, and that one word is change. He modernized Russia using a lot of Western influence. In doing so, he actually integrated Russia more into the rest of Europe. And it wasn't just that he integrated Russia in Europe. It was even more than that. He made Russia into a real European power. It was a force to be reckoned with among the other countries of Europe. Like Louis XIV was doing in France at the same time, Peter also helped push Russia towards a stronger absolutist government, one where he was in control of the advisors, the bureaucracy, and even the church. After Peter came quite a few emperors and empresses, most of them not ruling very long, but the next great ruler who brought stability in the Romanov dynasty wasn't even a Romanov herself, not even a native Russian. In fact, she was born in the German state of Prussia, not Russia, and she married the soon-to-be Tsar Peter III. Her birth name was Sophia Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg, but luckily for us, when she converted to Orthodoxy, she just became known as Catherine. So we don't have to know the whole long name in German. Instead, we just have Catherine. And the move to convert to Orthodoxy was, to really ingratiate herself with the Russian people and to be a part of the country. But it didn't just stop at, converting to Orthodoxy. She worked so hard to learn the Russian language that she gave herself pneumonia from staying up late at night studying. Her husband, Peter III, lasted only 6 months as Tsar, before he was actually forced to abdicate by Catherine and a group of her supporters. And then Catherine became empress herself. Peter III was killed 8 days later. It's not clear whether Catherine had anything to do with that or not, or whether that was just one of her supporters boldly doing it himself. Catherine was a follower of the Enlightenment, a movement which we looked at earlier. Remember Le Philosophe? She's a follower of the Enlightenment, and some consider her to be an enlightened despot. Just one, she didn't ever really share her power, so she was kind of what Voltaire was looking for in many ways. She wrote comedies, fiction, a series of memoirs, and she even wrote a manual on educating children that was inspired by John Locke. She's also known for writing letters back and forth with Voltaire, Diderot, and d'Alembert. Remember, Diderot and d'Alembert were the editors of the encyclopedia. And she even offered to Diderot a chance to finish the encyclopedia in Russia if France ever stopped the publication, which they were threatening to do. She invited some of the leading scientists and economists of Europe at the time to come to Russia. And she also worked to create a national school system that was based on Western learning. Included in this system was this institution that she had established called the Smolny Institute. And this was the first Russian school of higher learning for girls. It was limited at first to the nobility, but it is a school of higher learning for women, which is really something groundbreaking at the time in Russia. Like I said, it's the very first one. And that was integrated into her national school system. She also founded the first public library in the country, and here's the old building of it. So, first public library in the country. Remember, reading is thought to be a way of reaching enlightenment during this time. In 1852, she also established the Hermitage Museum from her personal collection of artwork. And here is the Hermitage Museum. She just had this great collection in the Winter Palace, opened it up as a museum for people to see, and it eventually became the Hermitage Museum. And it wasn't just collecting art. She was a patron of the arts. She supported people who made works of art as well. During her reign, Russia gained a good amount of land. They gained parts of Poland. So here we see in the darkish, like brown almost, what Catherine gained. So parts of Poland here, and then into the Crimea, more land in Central Asia, and then some in Northeast Asia. And she also sent people to colonize Alaska. More and more Russians were claiming that land as their own. So not just on the continent of Europe and Asia anymore. They are now moving on to the New World under Catherine. Catherine's legacy is much like Peter's the Great. What we see is a profound influence from the West, and in her case, from the Enlightenment especially. Her policies towards educating people using Western thought, as well as her promotion of the arts and sciences, brought what is called the Russian Enlightenment. So it brought the Enlightenment to Russia, and it even gets the name the Russian Enlightenment. This time is also seen as a golden age due to this Enlightenment, and also the general wealth of the nobles and the territorial gains of Russia. Really a high point in Russian history, especially the Russian Empire. The Romanov dynasty continued on after Catherine, but over time it faced more and more problems, famines and whatnot, and including in those problems were massive, large-scale revolts. And it wasn't until 1917 when the last Tsar was finally overthrown by the Bolsheviks and communist rule came to Russia. So it continued on after Catherine, but there were definitely bumps along the road. With that, we'll end here, and in the next lecture, we'll look again at France, who actually had some impact in Russia, which we'll see. This is Greg, signing off.